Hey guys, it's Libby. Welcome to my November wrap-up. I feel like I need to set the scene for this one for you a little bit, just in the filming situation. Right at the edge of my peripheral vision, when I look at the camera, I can witness the scene of yesterday's duck murder. This one duck went up and murdered this other duck. And it was right in the middle of the sidewalk. Someone moved the duck corpse out of the middle of the sidewalk, but it's still there, like right on the edge. And I don't know what to do. I don't want to touch the dead duck. I don't know who to call. Do I call like the building managers? Do I call the city government? I was really hoping that in the night, like a coyote would come and eat it, but apparently I live in Amsterdam now and we don't have coyotes. I never should have abandoned my home in the Eastern Woodland where all of your problems get eaten by scavengers in the night. So that will be why I grimace if I look over that way a little too much. Anyway, books. I read 4 of them in November, cower before my pure reading ability. Yes, 4 whole books. 2 of them were plays, and 2 of them were nonfiction. It was a novel-free month for Libby. I can see the duck. The first play can be easily dispensed with. It was Coriolanus by William Shakespeare, this month's Bard Book Club pick. I made a half-hour video in the Bard Book Club playlist if you want to get all my in-depth literary analysis on this. Just a reminder that the Bard Book Club videos are for people who have read the books, so it's full of spoilers and like out-of-context references that you won't understand unless you have read the book. So yes, read this play if you have not. I think it is really quite good, and it has like a lot of stuff to chew on. 5 stars. The second thing I finished was one of my nonfiction November picks, which was Sexing La Mode by Jennifer M. Jones. The subtitle is Gender, Fashion, and Commercial Culture in Old Regime France. Now this is kind of the book that slowed down my reading month and made it so that I didn't get through that much. Jennifer M. Jones, Dr. Jones, is not very good at writing. She is a professor at Rutgers, professor of history, and I'm sure she's a great professor, and there's a lot of like interesting information in this book. It just is very boringly presented. I found myself waiting for there to be long quotes from a primary source so that I could read somebody else's writing for a bit. There are several occasions where we get to read from the letters of, what's her name, Elisabeth Charlotte, who was the sister-in-law of Louis XIV. We get to read her letters to other people, and she was a snappy writer. Here is a picture of her looking fabulous. So this book is about like how fashion sort of acquired a gender, and that gender being feminine, in the early modern period, and also how it acquired a nationality, that nationality being French, and sort of how all that happened. Now I did complain about the writing, but I have to say Dr. Jones does not stray into academies, that sort of really high academic writing style where, you know, half the words don't actually mean anything. This is readable, and she does give you a lot of context. So I have a degree in like early modern French court culture. You do not need that in order to understand this book. You will be bored by it. And in fact, in the final third, what I decided to do was read the conclusion to each chapter, because she does write like a 1 or 2 page conclusion to each chapter. I would read that, pick whatever the most interesting sections were, and then sort of go back and figure out when she talked about those things earlier in the chapter. So I did not actually read the entirety of this book. Bite me. I gave it 3 stars, and this is where we get to Libby not knowing how to review nonfiction, because she doesn't do it very often. Like, the information is good, the text is good, I learned things with my brain. I think in the way that Jennifer wanted me to, but I was just really bored the whole time. I don't know how to rate it. So like if this was fiction, I would give this a 2 stars because it's just unreadable, but I didn't go into it for like beautiful writing. So I'm giving it a 3. maybe I will come back and re-score this once I am better at rating nonfiction. Who am I kidding? That's not going to happen. Then the third thing I finished was another Oscar Wilde play. This was Vera, or The Nihilists, which is one of his dramas rather than a comedy. I had this elaborate plan to read all of the plays of Oscar Wilde during Victober. I read about half the plays of Oscar Wilde during Victober, so throughout the winter I'm sort of finishing up. Right now I am working on Lady Windermere's Fan, and then I have his unfinished plays, and then I think I will have read all of them. So I'm just about there. So Vera, or The Nihilists, is a drama. Oscar Wilde's dramas are not as performed as his comedies, and it's because they're not as good. This, like our previous book, is set in the late 18th century, but now we are in Russia, and it's about a group called the Nihilists who basically are trying to murder the Tsar and institute a republic in Russia. Sound familiar? As you may know, since we're talking about the late 18th century and not the early 20th century, it does not work, so that kills a bit of the tension. It is kind of interesting that Oscar Wilde was writing this before the actual murder of the Tsar of Russia, which would happen, I think, during his lifetime, but after he wrote this play. So we have kind of some maybe almost interesting political machinations going on, and is totally killed by like the corniest romance that you ever read in your life. There are moments that are like totally ripped off of Romeo and Juliet. It's just like, I wish this dumb stuff wasn't happening. We could just get back to, you know, murdering the Tsar. I would give this play like a 2.5 stars. Only read it if you are a Wilde completionist, or if you're like really into stories of romance during Revolution. And honestly, I'd have to say if you're into stories of romance during Revolution in an academic sense, as opposed to in an enjoyment sense, because there's not that much that's enjoyable about it. Oh my god, these kids are so dumb. Okay, then last work of nonfiction was Talking Back, Talking Black, Truths About America's Lingua Franca by John McWhorter. I read this for the Voice Challenge, and Sexing La Mode was the Design Challenge. I am working on Sex with Shakespeare, which is for the Sport Challenge. And I was going to read Gifts of the Jews for whatever the third one was. But Sexing La Mode took so long that I decided I was not going to be getting to that. And so I just skipped right ahead to this one because it is a short book. This is only 167 pages, and it's also like smaller. Its surface area is smaller. So Sexing La Mode is what I would call a tall hardback, a tall hardcover. This one's much smaller than it. The book is divided into an introduction and 5 chapters, which I would almost say you can read as individual essays. There is like some reference to things that were brought up in previous chapters, but it's not utterly essential. So the first chapter, titled It's Complicated, gives a sort of the reasons for writing this book and an explanation of why Black English is important to study. Also, in the introduction, John McWhorter explains why he uses the term Black English, which is actually not one that I use, although now that I've read a book in which it's used over and over again, I've started doing it, because I think it's very American-centric. And I would say the biggest flaw of this book is that it suffers from Americocentrism. A lot of times when he says Black people, he's referring to Black people in the United States. Do not read this book if you are interested in the sociolinguistics of the Pengist Munch. Also, shout out to anyone else who knows what the Pengist Munch is. So anyway, the first chapter mostly covers why Black English is a language that is worthy of study and not just a bunch of people failing to speak English properly, and also it gives some of the characteristics, specifically grammatical characteristics of Black English. Chapter 2 is called What Do You Mean Sounds Black, and that gets more, it's like further into the grammar and also into some phonology and phonetics. Which one do I want? Phonology of Black English, and also like more subtle things like vocal timbre. And so there's a bit of sociolinguistics wrapped up in that as well. Chapter 3, but they can't talk that way at a job interview, is where you really start to get into like sociolinguistics, and particularly sort of how sociolinguistics works in the American mind, because America is quite unique in having a standard language that is spoken by the majority of people. And so it's weird, like the notion that you could have a home language and a public language doesn't really scan to most Americans, but that does scan to like most of the rest of the world. So in China, pretty much everybody can speak Mandarin, but you also have your own dialect, which you speak at home, and Americans will always read this as like failing to speak the standard dialect correctly, when you are in fact just speaking a different dialect. Then chapter 4 was speaking Black or speaking minstrel, which is more of a history of Black English, since mostly focused on since the Civil War, but you do get a little bit earlier than that. And it's about like, are there any elements of Black English that are like did not arise naturally in the Black American community, but that were like manufactured by minstrel shows, by white people writing minstrel shows. And then the last chapter, Through a Lens Darkly, what was the subtitle to that chapter? Perceiving Black English as It Is, Life Lessons. That appeared to be all the sort of shorter things that didn't fit into any of the other chapters, but that John McWhorter wanted to talk about. So now that you have that background, I will discuss my opinions. I am a big fan of John McWhorter. Since I know you are curious, and you may be so curious that you even paused this video to go investigate, John McWhorter is Black. And he teaches at, where is he currently at? Columbia. And he has a podcast called Lexicon Valley, which I am a total stan of. It's a podcast about linguistics. I highly recommend it. Except that I think it may have like slightly ruined my experience of this book, because a lot of the stuff that he talks about in the podcast is also in this book. So especially in the first chapter as well, I felt that the first chapter was unnecessary to me. I had an introductory linguistics course in college, which did include some sociolinguistics. So I already knew pretty much everything that was in the first chapter, either from that course or from listening to his podcast. Chapter 2 was about half things that I already knew from his podcast and half new information. But They Can't Talk That Way at a Job Interview. Chapter 3 was about half stuff that I knew from sociolinguistics, both his podcast and my course, and then half interesting new stuff. Speaking Black or Speaking Minstrel was definitely the best chapter of this book, because Black English has a really interesting history. And he talked about how if you listen to recordings of Black English speakers from the early 20th century, they actually sound like they have more of a Scottish or an Irish accent, and sort of why that is, what elements of Celtic or other like local British dialects have found their way into Black English, and also what elements of Jamaican English have ended up in Black English. So if you are not currently a fan of John McWhorter, I would say I recommend this entire book. If you are already a John McWhorter fangirl / guy, I recommend about 2/3 of this book. So if you feel like you already know what he's talking about, you can probably just skip ahead to the next section. And I will also leave a link down below to his podcast, Lexicon Valley, if you want the free John McWhorter experience. Star rating, like, objectively 4.5, subjectively 4. You know, my experience, since I already knew a lot of this material, was a 4, but I think the default experience would be a 4.5. Yes, that's the end of the video. Bye.